Welcome. You're listening to All Things Naval Aviation with your host, Rear Admiral John Meier, Commander, Naval Air Force Atlantic.
This is your host, Rear Admiral John Meier, and today I am truly honored to have the Director of Navy History and Heritage Command, Samuel J. Cox, retired Rear Admiral. Rear Admiral, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you today.
Well, thanks. I wanted to expand into your space, and as the Director of the Navy's History and Heritage Command, you take on a tremendous role of advising all of us and informing us, reminding us of just that, our history, our heritage, our culture, the rich culture. And today I wanted to talk about our Navy's response immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. As you know, carriers were at sea, which was fortuitous for our Navy as the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor and other locations in the Pacific and really devastated our battleship and our cruiser Navy at the time. And if it were not for the carriers being at sea, the war certainly would have been much more prolonged and, at the very least, potentially would have ended in a stalemate, although our industrial might really came to the forefront. Unfortunately, we had seen the storm clouds of war on the horizon and started building and purchasing and procuring some of the aircraft carriers that would actually carry the day later on in the war. Can you talk about the immediate response from our carrier fleet following Pearl Harbor for a moment?
Well, yes. I mean, everything you say is right on the mark. I would, add a couple things that. The reason the battle fleet was in Pearl Harbor on that morning was because the aircraft carriers were gone, and they had left on essentially what was national tasking, taking aircraft that had been stripped from already inadequate Pearl Harbor defenses that were known to be inadequate. But the Pacific Fleet Commander's, option was to keep the fleet at sea without air cover, or to put it in port with inadequate air cover. There's this sense that, before Pearl Harbor, the battleship admirals, didn't get it. Battleships were sunk at Pearl Harbor, and then the aircraft carrier is supreme. It's much more nuanced transition than that. The senior leaders of the Navy before Pearl Harbor understood the threat from aircraft. The aircraft carriers were critical to the defense of the battle line because everyone understood that the torpedo bombers from the enemy carriers were a mortal threat to the battleships at sea. So the primary purpose of the aircraft carrier was to take out the enemy's aircraft carrier before they could take your battleship. Problem in the exercises is the carriers would generally kill each other on the opening hours of the war, and then the battleships and surface things would clean up, afterwards. After Pearl Harbor didn't really have that option. 3 of the battleships that were damaged were actually operational within 2 weeks afterwards, because it's actually hard to sink a battleship with bombs unless you get a lucky hit like the Arizona. But they were also gas hogs and slow. And so for the opening phases of the war, when you needed, aircraft carriers to be fast and mobile to start hitting Japanese, bases around the periphery, and then with the Doolittle raid in April of 1942, which was the first time we struck back at a Japanese homeland, flying, twin-engine Army bombers off of an aircraft carrier, the Hornet, which, by the way, was actually the Navy's idea to do that. The mobility of the aircraft carriers was key, and the battleships that survived Pearl Harbor couldn't keep up, and there wasn't enough fuel to do them. So they got relegated to a secondary position, initially. The new battleships that came online starting in 1943, there were several of them that were online 1942, that once they carpeted them with 40 millimeter, 20 millimeter guns and 5-inch guns with radar proximity fuses, then they could defend themselves quite well against aircraft and and defended the aircraft carrier as well. The carrier was earlier carriers were vulnerable. We lost 4 of the 7 that were operational at the start of the war, but we learned a lot really quick. So by the end of the war, with the Essex class carriers, several of those carriers took punishment far greater than those that sank the carriers at the beginning of the war, and yet they survived. Franklin, Bunker Hill. But yeah, it was the mobility of the carrier in the early days of the war that was the critical attribute that allowed us to, one, slow down the Japanese and then eventually start turning the tide.
You touch on a host of really rich topics there. In particular, the innovation in the interwar period, and as the carriers came in, the ability for early pioneers in carrier aviation to really develop the tactics that would carry the day ultimately at Midway and through the remainder of the war. The brilliance of the Doolittle raid and the ability to launch that, planned and led by a lieutenant colonel in the Army Air Corps at that time, fascinating. Hard to believe to me at how junior a level some of those things were planned. But I think I'm most impressed with immediately after Pearl Harbor. We didn't sit back and lick our wounds, but our carriers immediately went on the offensive. Very shortly, within 2 months of Pearl Harbor, attacked Rabaul, which was the large Japanese fleet concentration area, and in the Marshalls and the Gilberts launched raids. And it was, in my mind, the offensive capacity, the offensive power of the carrier air wing and the evolution of that through the war that really brought the fight to the enemy. What was referred to as the Sunday punch, which was that offensive power of our carrier air wing at the time, was 36 Hellcats, 36 Helldiver dive bombers, and then 18 TBF Avengers, which we all remember that President Bush flew in World War II. But it was that offensive punch and that fighting spirit that really took full advantage of the maneuver ability of our aircraft carriers.
Yeah, I mean, that air wing you described, I mean, that's a 1943-44, air wing. In the early days, they were, Wildcats, TBDs, and Dauntlesses. And, key factor in the early raids was actually the code-breaking intelligence that could tell Nimitz that the Japanese carriers weren't anywhere near when we did those raids on Rabaul and the Kwajalein and in the Gilberts. And that allowed us to get extremely necessary and valuable combat experience and essentially, on-the-job training for our aviators, because we had a overinflated sense of how good we were and had really no clue how good the Japanese were. And in fact, even after Pearl Harbor, we still had this mindset, because Pearl Harbor was viewed, well, that was a sneak attack. It wasn't fair. In a fair fight, we're going to take them. And then, it turned out Coral Sea, that was we lost as many as they did. And certainly in the surface actions around Guadalcanal, I mean, those were all knockdown, drag out, even fights. It just, we could replace the losses and the Japanese couldn't. Same thing was true of their aircraft, as they kept their best pilots in the forward line until they died. And by October 1942, well over half of their highly capable Pearl Harbor pilots are gone, whereas we started, rotating our best guys back to train a new generation of really good pilots. So by the end of the war, the average American, Navy green pilot had, 600 hours of training time, and the Japanese were down to 100 or less on their pilots. So, and we also brought online better aircraft. But, in the interwar period, the pace of technological innovation, we talk about the pace of change today. I would argue, you go back then, it's incredible how quickly aircraft development. I mean, we talk about, the quote obsolete torpedo bombers at Midway that mostly, almost all of them got shot down, the TBDs. Well, in 1937, those same airplanes were the state-of-the-art, best in the world torpedo bombers. In the space of only 4 years, they went from that to being, inadequate to the task. I mean, that's just how fast things were changing during the interwar period, and the innovations that were brought to the aircraft carriers were, they actually did things for like the Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet that we can't do today. Those ships were designed so that they could launch and recover aircraft while steaming backwards, which they viewed as a potential counter to if something was damaged or something, they wanted the ability to be able to launch and recover aircraft going either direction, and we can't do that now.
Well, when you talk about Coral Sea, that's really a fascinating battle from a historical perspective. It's the first time that surface combatants engage without being in sight of each other. So it's the first time that the air wings fight or attack each other's ships, but the ships themselves do not engage each other. And your point on the cryptoanalysis really can't be overstated. I mean, the advantage that gave to Admiral Nimitz and really to the entire fleet in this battle, and really throughout the fleet, set the stage for us to engage at Coral Sea. I think my perspective is to perhaps lose tactically, but win strategically, because this was the first time that anyone had stymied the Japanese advance. And while they took some islands, they didn't take Port Moresby, and that obviously flowed into Guadalcanal, and we were really hanging on by our fingernails there. But that sets the stage just a month prior to Midway. And one of the aspects of that is most remarkable to me is the damage that Yorktown sustains in the Battle of Coral Sea. Limps back to Pearl, and the famous analysis as she comes into the shipyards. When you look at the pictures, just huge holes ripped in her side. Amazing that she actually made it back. And the estimates are, we can get her back to sea in 90 days, and Nimitz tells the ship workers that you have 72 hours. And that 72 hours, that remarkable effort by our industrial base to restore that ship to fighting spirit, and she probably is the tipping point, although we lost her in Midway. Without her, that's not the level playing field that we went into Midway with her there, even though she was newly recovered from her damage.
Yeah, all of that is exactly right. I mean, the key to Yorktown, though, was that she didn't take a torpedo hit at Coral Sea. And kind of the reason for that is the Japanese commander at Coral Sea launched a really daring twilight raid to try to catch the U.S. carriers. That didn't work, and he wound up losing a fair percentage of his best torpedo bombers and pilots, who, as they were flying over the carrier battle group, our carrier battle group couldn't see it, but our radar saw the planes, and our fighters actually ambushed them as they were going overhead. So the next day, when the main Japanese attack came in to the Lexington and the Yorktown, the Japanese were down a bunch of their best torpedo bombers, and enough of them got shot down that the Yorktown came through without that. Had she taken a torpedo hit, it would have been a completely different story. But yeah, the effort to repair her and get her underway was a phenomenal effort on the part of the shipyard in Pearl Harbor, and certainly was key to the Battle of Midway, because if she hadn't been available, it's probably unlikely that Nimitz would have risked, two carriers against at least four. They thought maybe there was five. That's a real sassy. But 3 against 4, plus another 120 airplanes from Midway Island itself. We actually had more tactical aircraft at the decisive point of contact during the Battle of Midway than the Japanese did. So yeah, Yorktown that whole thing was key to the Battle of Midway.
A couple points there. When you talk about the loss of the pilots, and the daring raid that ultimately ended up losing so many of their pilots from the carriers. The Japanese, although they didn't necessarily lose the carriers, they had one badly damaged, and then they had suffered enough losses that effectively the air wing was ineffective. They did some things with their air wing carrier pairings that were really coupled and not interchangeable, certainly not as flexible as we were. And if you look throughout the war in the Pacific, we did such a remarkable job, such an investment to protecting our aviators, fishing them out of the water. President Bush fished out of the water by a submarine that wasn't just a chance happening, that we would routinely put submarine pickets or other picket ships out. We had our PBYs out that were not only doing patrol work, but also recovering our pilots. And that played such an enormous role throughout the war in the Pacific.
Absolutely correct. Japanese air wing composition organization was different than ours in the sense that all of their repair maintenance was integral to the ship, and their carrier groups operated as an integrated pair, whereas ours were capable of independent operations. So after Coral Sea, Shikaku was badly damaged. And wasn't going to be repaired in time for Midway. But Zuikaku she could have participated. Her air wing had been severely mauled at Coral Sea, but you can make a case that the Japanese had really tried. They could have gotten the Zuikaku and an air wing to Midway, but they weren't organized. One, they weren't organized to fight that way, and two, they thought, well, we got 4 carriers, and they were sure they had sunk Yorktown, so they're thinking at most there's one other U.S. aircraft carrier out there. So 4 carriers is good enough. And, they were surprised when there were, not only 1 or 2, but 3. And, but yeah, we went to great lengths to rescue pilots. Japanese would too. They do some pretty amazing things to save their own guys that we kind of don't give them credit for. But the army was totally different. The army just squandered people like you wouldn't believe. But the Japanese Navy was actually pretty good about trying to, and would go to great lengths to rescue their own.
That's I wasn't aware of that, but it certainly helps when you carry the field, so to speak. So at Midway, we certainly had the luxury of recovering many pilots, and we lost a lot of pilots, but we recovered many. I don't think any Japanese pilots survived at Midway, at least from the carriers that were lost. Their losses were devastating there in terms of pilots and aircraft. At least we fished a bunch of ours out of the water that had been shot down.
Yeah, actually, that's a common misconception about Midway.
Okay.
It's actually less than 1/4 of the Japanese pilots who were there were lost. Most of the ones that were on board the ship were actually rescued off those ships and lived to fight another day. And the 25% that were lost were almost all those from the Hiryu's air wing that in their strikes against the Yorktown. She was the one that survived the initial dive bombings in the morning and lived to get off several strikes against both of which hit the Yorktown. Another amazing feat of damage control was that Yorktown got hit by bombs from the first strike from the Hiryu, and when the torpedo bombers were coming in 45 hours later from the Hiryu, their mission was don't attack the same aircraft carrier, go after a different one. But Yorktown had fixed the damage from the bombs so fast that the torpedo bombers thought it's a perfectly good carrier, so they went after the same ship twice. So Enterprise and Hornet never even, their fighters engaged Japanese, but their anti-aircraft gunners never had to defend those 2 ships. But yeah, most of the Japanese pilots actually did survive the Battle of Midway, and then it was Eastern Solomons and especially Santa Cruz where they just got the attrition rate was so high, and then the year of battle around Guadalcanal that by October 1942, well over half of their best pilots are gone.
Well, there is nothing like talking to the Navy's historian to perhaps recalibrate one or to tighten me up on my recollection of history. I very much appreciate that. One of my favorite quotes is, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And while we're clearly both students of history, I think our Navy is founded on the ideals of the American fighting spirit and skill that carried the day in the Pacific, certainly through the battles that we discussed today, Coral Sea, the early raids, Midway. The aspect of learning from history is enormously important. And for our next podcast, I want us to shift the discussion now more towards the direction of the evolution of the air wing. We touched briefly on the points that the air wing did evolve, and the Sunday Punch air wing that I referred to was a little bit later in the war, but it evolved rapidly. Our evolution of the air wing today and the air wing of the future is just that, on today's level of technology, at range, at extreme ranges, at distance, bringing in low observables and unmanned aircraft. The carrier air wing of the day today has airborne electronic warning with our new E-2D Disc 3 aircraft, with the E-18G Growler and the advent of the next generation jammer pod, the F-35, the MQ-25. The list goes on, and that evolution continues in naval aviation. And it's the lessons of how we trained our aviators, how we developed our tactics, how we developed our material resources for the air wing advance, but also took such great advantage of maneuver, lethality, and the American ingenuity and fighting spirit that will prevent or win the wars of the future. Admiral Cox, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today on everything naval aviation, and I look forward to our next opportunity to discuss the future of naval aviation.
Okay, thanks. Having spent many years of my career on board aircraft carriers, I definitely have a soft spot for them. So, and I would only add that, when people think of the Navy, they think of ships. They really should think of air power at sea, because you command the sea by commanding the air over the sea, and we could get into that discussion some other time.
That is a great note to end on. Again, thank you, and to all our listeners, join us for our next discussion in a couple of weeks. I look forward to that, and we're going to basically move this around. We're going to try to get into some video podcasts as well, perhaps at the Pensacola Naval Aviation Museum or some other significant historical sites. That's all.